Good evening and welcome. Welcome to an amazing event. We are here, we are live, and I'm so excited to introduce you to what we're going to do tonight, which is, of course, The Color of Wealth, the destruction of Greenwood and Tulsa's legacy of loss, brought to you by the Institute on Race and Political Economy at the New School and Justice for Greenwood. I'm your hostess, Karen Hunter. I'm, of course, the host of SiriusXM, The Karen Hunter Show, 3 to 6 p.m. Eastern, and the founder of narrative.com. And today we're going to talk about Tulsa, Oklahoma, its legacy, and what we can do in the future to prevent it from happening again. Yes, I'm adding that to the agenda. Of course, today we commemorate 100 years ago, 1921, the massacre, the decimation of what is known as the Greenwood section of Tulsa. It is one of hundreds of thriving Black communities, but it is known as the most destructive race massacre in this country's history. 100 years ago, people who came to Tulsa in hopes of a better life, who built something that very few people have been able to duplicate since, were destroyed in 2 days. And today we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the legacy, and we're going to talk about what we can do to fix it. Joining us is, of course, the Deputy Director of the National Urban League, the one and only Joy Olivia Cheney, as well as Afranima Bew, Dr. Afranima Bew. She is the research affiliate with the Institute on Race and Political Economy at the New School. Wes Moore, CEO of Robin Hood. Demario Solomon Simmons, the justice warrior himself, founder of Justice for Greenwood Foundation, and Professor Derek Hamilton, founding director of the Institute on Race and Political Economy at the New School. Up next is a short video that will kind of give you some insight into what we're going to be experiencing today as we talk about this divide, this racial divide, this economic divide, and what Tulsa means for us today.
Here in Tulsa, a tale of two cities.
The north side has been left behind, while the south side has grown economically.
Two neighborhoods just miles apart, but the inequality between them is massive.
Is this common, buildings like this that are dilapidated, broken down here in North Tulsa?
Absolutely.
Nehemiah Frank is the editor-in-chief of the Black Wall Street Times. He has studied the divide for years.
This plaza used to be a grocery store.
About half of the city's Black population lives in North Tulsa, an area where 33% of the population lives below the poverty line. But just miles down the road, South Tulsa is more than 70% white and has twice the median household income.
Are there things that South Tulsa has that North Tulsa does not?
South Tulsa has better schools. Our schools are essentially school-to-prison pipelines.
It's a divide that dates back centuries, perhaps most vividly culminating in the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, when a group of white residents burned and destroyed the historic Greenwood district, more than 30 blocks of Black homes and businesses, commonly referred to as Black Wall Street. An area that is still being rebuilt almost 100 years later.
Does that 1921 race massacre still impact Tulsa today?
Yeah, it still impacts us. We never rebuilt, we never recuperated all the business that was lost. Looks like 1921.
That divide affects more than just the residents' livelihoods. It also affects their health. Studies show that residents in wealthier South Tulsa are expected to live 11 years longer than those in North Tulsa. Dr. Gibran Pasha sees huge disparities between his patients.
If you grew up in North Tulsa, certain parts of North Tulsa, you are more likely to have a stroke. You're more likely to suffer from heart disease, to die at a younger age. And for any physician, that really should set some alarms off.
Alarms that many residents say should mark the beginning of a new era.
Tulsa is waking up, and I think that Tulsa wants to become one Tulsa and not the city of two.
Morgan Radford, NBC News, Tulsa.
You think 100 years ago, a street that had 8 doctors and dentists and 2 theaters and a thriving business district, and people were healthy and they were happy, and that was all wiped out. We're going to explore that right now. We're going to turn to an upcoming report, the findings of that report, The Color of Wealth in Tulsa. And first, we're going to share a clip describing the real power of wealth from Derek Hamilton. Derek Hamilton, of course, is university professor, the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy, and the founding director of the Institute on Race and Political Economy at the New School. This clip is from a 2018 Inequality in America town hall held at the Capitol with Senator Bernie Sanders, Senator Elizabeth Warren, Michael Moore, and, of course, Derek Hamilton.
There virtually has never been a substantial black middle class if we're defining it in terms of wealth. It's not just wealth as an outcome, it's what wealth can do for your life. We've talked about political power. If you got wealth, you can get political power. If you're faced with an expensive legal system, wealth will allow you to address that condition. If you have medical bills, wealth allows you to address your condition. If you want to send your child to an elite private school or university, those that have wealth can do so. We often think about wealth in terms of what the end is, but the real power of wealth is what it can do for people. It gives you choice, it gives you freedom, it gives you agency. Now let's think about what wealth is in terms of numbers. The top 10% of households have over 75% of the nation's wealth. The bottom 50% of households have about 1% of the nation's wealth. So however unequal we are in terms of wealth, race becomes a bigger predictor of somebody's wealth position than class itself. The typical black household has about 10 cents on the dollar the typical white household, and that's including home equity. We know that if you are a head of household and you're black and you graduated from college, your family's wealth position is lower than that of a white family where the head dropped out of high school. So this feeds into the narrative of, can we simply work hard, study hard, and address inequality?
There's an amazing ladder in America for anyone to climb, right? Anyone can climb it.
The answer is no. When we start getting into these narratives of a post-racial society, we're not there. Now, we can come up with comprehensive programs that include everybody, but we need to do it differently this way so that we make sure nobody is left behind, regardless of your race, gender, disability status, etc.
Yes, no one should be left behind. Up next is Dr. Afrana Bew. We're going to talk about those numbers, and she's going to share with you key data points from the findings in the report that we're going to be experiencing right now. Dr. Afrana Bew, welcome.
Hello.
Hi.
Again, hello.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
my name is Afrana Bew, and I'm a research affiliate with the Institute on Race and Political Economy at the New School. And I'm presenting findings from the upcoming Color Wealth in Tulsa report. So the advanced executive summary will be available on the Institute website in the coming days. In solemn commemoration of the Tulsa Race Massacre, the summary focuses on the disparities in wealth between Black and white families in the Tulsa area. The forthcoming report will include other racial, ethnic groups and Native American tribal groups. So you can go to the next slide. And this report builds on other studies in the Color of Wealth series, including those focused on Miami, Los Angeles, the nation's capital, and Boston. The data in these reports is from the National Asset Scorecard for Communities of Color, or NASC. NASC was developed to supplement existing national asset and debt surveys in the United States, which have not been designed to examine wealth differences across ethnically plural communities and at the local level. The NASC data disaggregates groups by ancestral origin, looks at assets and debts in localized contexts, and includes attributes that are specifically related to communities of color. Go to the next slide. So we acknowledge the funders and partners that have contributed to the development of these reports. You can go forward. Before we turn to the NASC data and disparities in wealth between Black and white households in Tulsa, we want to share some context about what happened to the Black population as a result of the massacre. We know that hundreds of Black residents were killed, thousands more injured, and 1,500 homes and businesses were destroyed and burned to the ground. This table is constructed from the 1920 decennial census that took place just before the massacre and the 1930 decennial census that took place after. The populations of both Black and white residents grew, but the Black population grew by only 16% compared to 106% for the white population. In fact, the ratio of Black residents to white residents fell dramatically by 43%. So now I will turn to the NASC data. This survey was taken in 2014 in the Tulsa metropolitan area, and I'll share some background about the respondents. Black and white households were equally likely to have at least some college experience or higher. White households were more likely to be married or live with a partner. We saw that incarceration rates were relatively high in general in Tulsa, and Black respondents were twice as likely to report that they or an immediate family member had experienced incarceration. And finally, we saw that borrowing money from a predatory payday lender was more common among Black households. So next, let's get into findings related to assets. We saw disparities among households in liquid assets, which are assets that can readily be converted to cash and are especially crucial in times of emergency. One of the biggest differences between Black and white households was in stocks, with 37% of white households owning stocks compared to just 5% of Black households. Similarly, 40% of white households had individual retirement accounts or private annuities compared to 13% of Black households. For checking and savings accounts, there were smaller differences between Black and white households, but to put this into context, picture the 9% of Black households that don't have a checking account and the 13% that don't have a savings account. And this could relate to the vulnerability to payday lending that I showed you in the previous slide. So next, we turn to business and home ownership. We found that 44% of Black families were homeowners compared to 85% of white households. Not only are Black families less likely to own homes, we found the value of homes was just 39% of that of white households. In terms of business ownership, white families in Tulsa had a 14% business ownership rate, while Black families had a statistically significant smaller ownership rate of 1%. And for those households that reported owning a business, the median value of business equity held by white households was $20,000, while for Black households, that was virtually $0. Next, we will look at the value of assets. We found that the typical white household had $12,000 in readily accessible liquid assets compared to virtually $0 for Black households. In terms of total assets, which includes the liquid assets as well as homes and businesses, the value for white families was $155,000. Black families own just 8% of that at $12,000. So next, we'll look at some aspects of household debt. As shown in the middle chart, Black households were almost 3 times as likely to have student loan debt as white households. And this is particularly alarming when we consider the fact that society encourages Black mobility through college degree attainment. Black students are much more likely to acquire student loan debt because of the racial wealth gap and inability to pay for college otherwise. And it's really devastating if you go to college and don't graduate, yet you're stuck with these student loans. And this could be cyclical. This debt could be why people don't end up graduating from college. Another type of debt we looked at was credit cards. So as you can see in the first chart, we found that white households were more likely to have credit card debt. However, the amount of credit card debt was 31% higher for Black households. As I noted earlier, Black households are also more likely to have payday loans, which have much higher interest rates than credit cards. We also found that the median value of total non-housing debt is 37% higher for Black households. So next, we're going to turn to income and wealth. White household median incomes in Tulsa were almost 3 times greater than Black median incomes. Compared to other regions around the nation, the Tulsa Black-white income disparities are large, but what we find is that the disparities in wealth are even worse. White families had a median wealth of $145,000, while Black families had a median wealth of $8,000. This means that the typical Black family had only 6 cents for every dollar owned by a typical white household. The Black-white wealth gap in Tulsa is 6 times greater than the Black-white income gap. And you can go to the next slide where we have disaggregated some of our findings by educational attainment and also by age. So on the left, we looked at households with at least an associate degree, which should be somewhat better off than households with just a high school degree. Black households with at least an associate degree were statistically less likely than similar white households to be banked, to own a home, and to own a vehicle. These Black households had just 12% of the wealth of white households. Then on the right, when examining heads of households who were 51 to 65 years old and closer to retirement, we saw similar patterns of less banking, home ownership, and vehicle ownership for Black households. And in this 51 to 65-year-old age category, where People should have the most wealth as they near retirement. Black households had just 5% of the wealth of their white counterparts. So to conclude, wealth is the most important measure of economic security and well-being. Wealth allows families to better cope with unexpected shocks such as sickness, unemployment, and now even the negative consequences of the pandemic. Given the iterative and intergenerational nature of wealth accumulation without redress, the Tulsa Race Massacre that occurred over 100 years ago is inseparable from grave differences that exist today. So this concludes the presentation of the data from the upcoming Color of Wealth report, and I'll turn it back over to Karen.
Oh, that was stunning, and not in a good way. A couple of those stats took my breath away. We're going to talk more about that. But right now, we're going to hear from some of the descendants, because these were real people and they have real stories. So we're going to do a spotlight from Justice for Greenwood. This is pre-recorded. It features DJ Mercer, who's a descendant coordinator from Justice for Greenwood. Also Barbara Barrows and Maureen Scott. They are descendants of Jack and Daisy Scott. And in this clip, they're going to discuss the legacy of the massacre and what could be done to close this wealth gap that Dr. Viewer put out just now, and address the inequalities created in 1921.
How about reparations in the form of educational scholarships for them? What about the financial reparations for the three known living survivors? There's a lot that they can do. They can set up a wing in a hospital that deals with the high blood pressure and the death from smoking. Yet they can do a lot with the money.
What do you say to people who think parks and museums are forms of reparations? Because you two don't live in Tulsa. So how does a park in Tulsa and a museum in Tulsa benefit you?
It doesn't.
It doesn't.
It doesn't.
I mean, that we're descendants of we're grown now. We've had our education, our careers, but what about our children and grandchildren? We have enough. We have parks. I'm sure Tulsa has a lot of parks.
We do.
And I think that one of the other things that they can do is that you can look at the disparity between the north side and the other side, south side. I mean, this just visually, you can see the difference. How about putting some of that money into better schools, better grocery stores, better housing? There's lots of things that they could have done that would help to facilitate the city of Tulsa, that would benefit more Black people than what they have. Because that museum, that's not benefiting any of us, not even the three survivors that you've identified.
Exactly. And how about a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing? I mean, that's not money, but it's a beginning.
But put all that money that they've raised into building this museum, but not give it over to the survivors, to me is insane.
Exactly. And I think I should add seed money for entrepreneurship for Blacks, forgive the loans. I mean, give them something. Remember the businesses that were taken away, and nothing was given back.
Like, I would love for our grandparents' land to be put back into our family's name. Give us back our land. That university, that school sits on the land that my grandparents owned.
But this is a time of cancel culture. A lot of things are going to be happening. Willa and Charles Bruce got their park back. So it's beginning. So I'm optimistic.
All right. So I'm gonna ask both of you this question, but I want to ask Maureen first. If you could say something to Mayor Bynum, the mayor of Tulsa, what would you say to him as a descendant of Greenwood?
Stop flip-flopping. My first thing. Because when I first read the things about him, I said, "Oh, this is pretty cool." With the mass, the exhumation of the mass graves, and now, get out from under Trump's umbrella, and realize that you can be voted out just like you were voted in. Those are my words for him.
Yeah. And I think for me, it would be very similar to that. He's had one face publicly and another face behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Show your true colors.
Show your true colors. That was, of course, Barbara Marie Barrows and Maureen Scott. And joining us right now is Wes Moore, head of Robin Hood, the other Wes Moore, author as well. And we're going to talk with, oh no, I apologize. My fault. We're going to bring in the panel. This is where I'm really looking forward to talking with, of course, Professor Derek Hamilton, Joy Cheney, Olivia Cheney, and attorney Demario Solomon Simmons. These descendants were very clear about all of the things that can happen or that should happen as a result. We had the President of the United States of America in Tulsa gave a nice speech. No words on reparations and no apologies. What of among you, and I'm going to start with attorney Demario Solomon Simmons, because you have been a driving force in this fight, this justice for Greenwood. What needs to happen next, in your opinion, to make good for what happened 100 years ago?
Well, first, let me just say, Karen, just like you, I was shocked with the numbers when I first saw them. Once Derek started, Dr. Hamilton started giving us this information, we're so excited that he chose to partner with us at the Justice for Greenwood Foundation. I'm excited and honored to be on this panel with you and also with Joy. To see these numbers bear out what I've seen my whole life and what I see each and every day. Even so, I'm just blown away, even though I had seen these numbers even before we got on this call, to just see them laid out so specifically here. It's just shocking. That's just the only way to state it. And that's why I will say that, yes, we are excited and happy that our work got the nation to focus on Greenwood. And we were thankful that the president came here and had words, but we are disappointed that the president didn't talk about a real reparations, a comprehensive reparations plan, what we will want a Greenwood plan. After World War II, when the European countries were bombed out, they were bombed back to the medieval times, France and Denmark and Holland and all over Germany. The United States of America led what they called a Marshall Plan, because they said these people need help, and they need help in all things. They need help in housing. They need help in banking. They need help in healthcare. They need help in infrastructure. And we pour billions upon billions of dollars into countries that we ourselves have bombed. Yet when it comes to Black people right here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who were also bombed from the air and from the ground, there hasn't been anything. And as this research has stated and has shown so conclusively, so starkly, so profoundly, without a comprehensive Greenwood plan, a comprehensive reparations plan, a comprehensive, what we call in our lawsuit, an abatement plan, Black people in Tulsa would never, ever have an opportunity to catch up. You're talking about net median wealth being $145,000 for white Tulsans, and on average, Black people having $8,000 in wealth. It is unbelievable, except I see it every single day.
Dr. Hamilton, Greenwood wasn't built by government money, by handouts, as some people might look at reparations, unfortunately. Greenwood was built by people who had a vision for and a love for one another, who had a community, but also who lived under segregation and whose dollars circulated 19 times in their community. Is reparations the answer? Should there be a comprehensive package? I know the answer to that, but should there be something else as well? You have to unmute, brother, please, because we need to hear you.
Yeah. And I should have led with gratitude. So I'm glad I was muted, because it gives me an opportunity to center myself and say thank you to all of you. Please do call me Derek. And Demario, you've been carrying this banner like gangbusters. So a lot of credit. I know you're tired. I know you're putting in all these hours and things and bringing all this attention. And the good thing is we're in this moment. So the attention is here. So let me answer the question. The question is yes, and reparations is absolutely necessary. But what was demonstrated by Tulsa is that even when Blacks were able to amass economic security, they were politically vulnerable to theft, destruction, fraud, and outright terror by state complicit actions. And that's the key point. And that brings us right back to what Demario was talking about. The state has a responsibility to acknowledge it and atone for it and redress it. And that's the key thing people need. They need economic security and a political codification that they can't randomly be extracted from, exploited, or just outright terrorized.
Joy Cheney, how do we make them do it? Urban League, you have a powerful organization, and as Dr. Hamilton pointed out, we need this and that. How do we make the levers of political power? What needs to happen next?
Well, first of all, we do what DeMario has been doing, what Dr. Hamilton have been doing, putting that action out there that DeMario has been doing, and almost single-handedly by himself with survivors. And so kudos to you. And then adding that with the data that really supports the argument that we have been making. And it almost feels insulting. Thank God for Dr. Hamilton, but we don't want to take away from his work. But honestly, whether it's this report, or whether it's the National Urban League Equality Index, or whether it's the Brookings report, or whatever, we know that there's a Black-white wealth gap, and we know what is connected to the systematic theft of Black wealth. And whether it's physical property or intellectual property, any way that you look at it, beginning with the theft of our bodies. And so what we have to do is to say it and demand it. It hasn't been long that we have been actually, all of us together, collectively having a conversation about needing and demanding reparations. But from the state, yes, but also from corporate America.
Yes.
I think we all know what happened with the Jesuit priests, $100 million. It is possible in this moment that we are in to both demand and then get redress. So yes, we need it from our government, and it should come, in my view, in terms of dollars, but also in terms of investment. Absolutely. I'm glad to see what the president did today in terms of some of the announcements that are made around small businesses and other investments. That's a start. That's a great place to be. But we also have to see real money, and we also have to hold our businesses accountable.
Is Tulsa a microcosm of Black America? As I mentioned before, there were hundreds of Black Wall Streets in this country, hundreds of communities that were thriving, self-built, didn't need anything outside. If we can't get reparations in Tulsa, what does that say for the rest of America and reparations at large? DeMario.
I definitely think that Tulsa is the point of the spear, and it has to be the case study. If you can't win here, then where can we win? When we have 3 living survivors, and not only do we have 3 living survivors, we have such strong documentation of what was lost, who lost it, where did they live, insurance claims that were not paid. I mean, the documentation is so specific and so overwhelming. And then when you couple that with this report that Dr. Hamilton and his magnificent team has put together, along with my team member, Kate Ritchie, who's done a great job here, how can you deny it? And that's why we must win Tulsa. If we can't win Tulsa, where can we win? But we can win Tulsa when we stand together strong, when organizations and people with platforms like you, Karen, and organizations like the National Urban League and the Congressional Black Caucus, who came down here, several members who stood strong and introduced legislation. I want to give a big shout out to Representative Hank Johnson, my fraternity brother, who introduced legislation. A shout out to Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, who was here. Congresswoman Maxine Waters, and the list goes on and on. And we must win Tulsa, and we can win Tulsa. And when we win Tulsa, we can emulate that across this nation. As you said, as many other Black Wall Streets, and from a national level, we must have a national Greenwood plan. But let's start first with Tulsa, with Greenwood.
We have to all get on the same page. So I want to, again, thank all of the people who are here today, because it requires all of us to not just be outraged and emotional, but then to do something, right? So this is an opportunity. I want to also ask questions from people who registered, because I'm being greedy right now. I have 11 questions, but I could talk to each of you individually on my radio show. Let me go to the folk that ask questions. There's a question for you, Dr. Hamilton. Compared to the other cities you've covered with this research question, how was Tulsa different? Did any results stand out or surprise you? Were there consistent results across all cities?
So I'll start with the latter one. The consistent result is that wherever you look, Black people were broke. Wherever you look, Black people had no wealth. And that leads to the previous answer, as well as the question, that Tulsa is a vivid example but it's really a microcosm of what Black people have experienced throughout history in the United States, that they've always remained in fear of state-sanctioned violence to extort not only their wealth and assets, but their literal mobility, that they have not benefited from the public policies that literally built the white asset middle class. You know, people talk about entitlements as a dirty word, but entitlements built an American middle class. It just didn't do it for Black people. You know, I'll give another quick shout out. I love that DeMario referenced the Marshall Plan, because the Marshall Plan is also America's best foreign policy ever. It prevented a World War III. It provided economic development in a way to avoid a fascist dictator to come along and, you know, implement something like a Holocaust, or, you know, dare I say what Donald Trump did, talk about building a wall to keep Mexicans out. If we want to avoid fascism, we need broad economic development. And if we want a moral economy, then we have to start with that original sin, slavery, and then go well beyond slavery and acknowledge all the harm that the state has inflicted and redress it. And from there, you know, reparations is necessary, but it won't even be sufficient. Because if we gave reparations and remained vulnerable to another Tulsa massacre, that won't solve the problem. So prospectively, we need to ensure that in perpetuity, government is doing their fiduciary responsibility of ensuring a moral economy with economic security so that people can have authentic agency in their lives.
Wow.
Joy Cheney, Joy.
Correct.
Yes, yes. We could snap fingers on that. The Urban League. Another question from someone who registered. The Urban League promotes economic empowerment through education and job training, housing and community development, workforce development, entrepreneurship, health, and quality of life. In terms of quality of life, how is it that you see these wealth inequalities implicating the well-being of Black families and communities? Can you talk a little bit about how these inequalities can affect individuals and families over a lifetime, and conversely, how increased access to opportunity might improve the quality of life?
Absolutely. So Urban League has 90 plus, affiliates across the country, and we're seeing all the things that Derek was talking about there, right? In terms of a Black-white wealth gap, whether it's great community or whether it's smaller, there's always a large wealth gap. How this compounds over a lifetime is, if you have the resources to have money in your savings account, you can, just in the housing market, it's the difference between whether you can have a 20% down payment or whether you have no down payment. It's the difference between whether or not you can get a loan. When my mother was a doctor and was trying to start, she could not get a business loan. Okay, so the other male doctors, white doctors, were able to get business loans, and she wasn't able to do that, which meant all of the things that she did had to come out of earned income. That put her behind significantly. And as a family, that compounds. Then the next, you can't do certain things. You can have wonderful things, but it's not in the same way. It doesn't compound the same. It robs you of generational wealth. It's less savings, less ability to have access to credit, less ability to create more wealth, right? To be able to create more wealth. I think someone said it earlier in something we read, just the ability to be able to invest in the stock market. Those are things that none of the folks that we were talking about here today have access to because that wealth was robbed of them. Folks are trying to make ends meet. The GI Bill built a middle class for white America. The Marshall Plan built other countries. Urban League has called for a Main Street Marshall Plan and has for a long time, far beyond this conversation, because we recognized what was happening in our communities, a need to reinvest in middle and main America, all of us, including Black people. We have been left behind, and we want to have some of the American dream that was once in Greenwood that turned into a nightmare. We're looking for that again for people today, and we know we can have it. We have to demand it, but we know that we can have it. And this awakening that we've had now with George Floyd and with so many other things. All of these issues are compounding together because they're all the same. And we are now saying we want police fair treatment. We want fair treatment when we go into banks. We want fair treatment when we are sitting in front of an appraiser. To have Black people in 2021 have to talk about whether we're going to remove our photos from the wall of our homes is unacceptable.
It is, and
we
just
can't have that anymore.
And to piggyback on what you're saying is not just the GI Bill. The whole New Deal excluded people who were domestic workers and people who worked in the fields.
Black people.
Until the 1970s. It didn't say Black people. It didn't say Black people, but we know who they were targeting.
Right, that's right. It didn't say Black people, but it was Black people. That's who the domestics are, including my oldest living survivor, Viola, who was run out of her house when she was 7 years old. Because she left Tulsa, she never got beyond the 4th grade, and she had to work as a domestic with white families for over 50 plus years, and they didn't pay her anything correctly. So when I met her, this woman, this wonderful, amazing woman at 106 years old, was living by herself in a 1-bedroom apartment in extreme abject poverty, getting the least amount possible from Social Security at 106 years old because of the policies that you stated. Karen, I'm just getting livid here as I think about these numbers again. And, right now here in Tulsa, you got people talking about financial empowerment, financial literacy. We don't need financial literacy. We need finances. We need resources. Can't nobody budget better than my mama. I don't know how the hell we ate and had all our bills paid each month because she only got about $650 a month for the 3 of us. We don't need that. We need resources pumped into our community. And also on these insurance companies, you mentioned that, someone mentioned insurance companies. There were 1,400 claims that were filed by these.
How many repeat that?
1,400 claims were filed against insurance companies and the city and the county. And we have found out of these hundreds of claims that were filed, there are 13 companies that are still in operation today, including AIG, including the Hartford companies, including CNA, including Chubb companies, including California Casualty and Great American and North River and Star Personnel and Phoenix and Aetna. These companies are operating today. These companies help steal the wealth, just like the governmental officials, just like the chamber. And guess what? The banks stole our money also. After the houses burnt down, our people couldn't go to the banks because they said, well, you don't have your bank book. Well, it burnt down. Well, too bad. And they stole our money. And 2 of those banks are still in operation today, one being Chase Bank and one being Bank of Oklahoma. We are engaging in conversations with both those banks and many of these insurance companies. So everyone is complicit. Everyone must pay, and everyone must give us a Marshall Plan, what we call the Greenwood Plan, so we can get back not only where we were, but where we could have been if we had been allowed to grow organically.
Let's talk about what could have been. And Attorney Demario Solomon Simmons, to give those beautiful centenarians, no, I'm not saying that correctly, 100-year-old plus people who survived things that they're still traumatized by to this day, a check for $100,000. That was the generosity of us, not those corporations and those companies that actually owe them that money. That was our generosity, and God bless you for presenting it. I don't know. I just want to know, like, what is the outcome of them receiving this money? It can't make up for what they didn't receive, but how has it changed their lives?
Not at all. And I do thankful because Karen, coming on your show, listeners, people giving it $25, $50, $7,500, and it's just a gift. The $100,000 our little bitty Justice for Greenwood Foundation was able to raise is a gift. It's not reparations. It's nowhere close to what they deserve. I mean, 100 years of the trauma, 100 years of the destruction, 100 years of loss of earned opportunities and earned income. But we wanted to show them that they had a community, a nationwide community of people that are standing with them, fighting for them and their descendants in this community. And that $100,000 was just a gift. But we want to do much more for them and the survivors and our community. And so anyone that wants to join in with us, just the same way you have, Karen, and way the National Urban League and Dr. Hamilton and the New School, we invite others to join with us. Go to justiceforgreenwood.org and join this fight because we can win it. And when we see these numbers again, they are so profound. But when you come to Tulsa, like so many people have done this weekend, and you drive down that interstate that they drove right through our community intentionally, and you look on the south side and see a full, bustling, first-rate, modern city for white Tulsans, and you look on the north side and see a desolate food desert, no hospital, third world ghetto that me and my people live in, you see why these numbers are so shocking, but more shocking when you see them each and every day.
You mentioned the freeway, the highway, the interstate. Tulsa rebuilt. Greenwood rebuilt after that massacre, after that decimation. And Greenwood was bigger. Well, and then, I mean, maybe not more financially stable because you lost AC Jack, you lost human capital.
Yeah, about 35 to 40% of those who lost never rebuilt. We lost a significant population of African Americans, as the data shows that he just showed today. Our percentage of the actual city went down from 22% down to 10%. So when they say Greenwood rebuilt, yeah, Black people are resilient. Yeah, Black people are going to do what we need to do. But Greenwood didn't never really rebuild because, like you said, we lost J.B. Stratford, the richest man in Greenwood. We lost A.J. Smitherman. We lost Dr. A.C. Jackson, the top Black surgeon in the nation at the time. We lost O.W. Gerlin, who owned dozens and dozens of property. We lost so many people. We don't even know the magnitude of the loss. So yes, some people were able to rebuild, but Greenwood as itself was never able to recover. We were never able to have the land that we had. We were never able to have the freedom mind state because of the fear that they put in us by coming down and burning us out, destroying us, and putting the KKK, the largest KKK clavering or meeting hall right next to Greenwood a year after the massacre. Not paving.
Karen, let me jump in.
Go ahead,
Karen,
Joy.
let me just jump in just to say, though, what DeMario is talking about so passionately didn't just happen in Tulsa. We're talking about Tulsa tonight, but it happened all over the country, almost like a roadmap before and after Tulsa. Rosewood, not far from where I'm from, Ocoee, Louisiana, where I'm from, because I'm going to shout that out because I'm here tonight. All over the country, if you've not gone to Commons page, he notes that all of the different places. Click on those links and find out where the National Urban League retweeted it. Look and research. This happened all over the nation, a robbing of human capital and intellectual capital. There's no way we could build that back. And even if we did, you can't account for the loss that was involved there.
I was simply making the point that we built back and then they ran a highway through. And we saw that in Mississippi, we saw that in Alabama. So even when we get back up, we're never going to New York. There's always another trick, right? And I want to ask that question. That's going to be my last question. But before we do, Derek Hamilton, Dr. Hamilton, tell us about the actual monetary value of Black Wall Street and what that would mean today had they been able to be left alone to live their Black happy lives.
So I'll say a couple of things about that. I won't give you an exact answer. You know, some people would say, well, look at the racial wealth gap. That's the difference. I actually think it's more nuanced than that, because in a lot of ways, white assets are depressed as a result of the race riots, because from a political standpoint, we are able to have concentrations of capital so much because there is an exchange where people care about not just their vertical position, but their horizontal position. So what is offered to white people en masse is relative positioning. That a lot of what took place in Tulsa was envy. White people simply resenting the fact that Black people had. So sadly, they were vulnerable to relative status, literally what we might call white supremacy or the property rights and whiteness. The property rights and whiteness has a counterfactual of relative to Black people, how do I fare? So if you have an economic downturn, sadly, there's value to not being the first fired or the last hired. So all of that was the nuance to say that the number is probably even larger than the gap that we presented to you. DeMario said it is larger than $100,000. So me evading the question doesn't mean there's an answer, because there really is. It would take rigor, analysis to go back and talk about what would be the present value of what would have existed had this not occurred. And we do it all the time. I'll say this real quick. This is why it's all hands on deck. This is why pursuing the lawsuits and tort, because, as Joy pointed out, Tulsa's not unique, but Tulsa has some uniqueness. DeMario has pinpointed some exact entities that bear some responsibility. And this is why all hands on deck through torts, through Congress. But at the end of the day, for us to achieve racial justice, the federal government has to implement a full-throated reparations program.
As I was taking the virtual tour to see 8 different doctors, not just the dentist, not just the, we're in a healthcare crisis right now, Black America. To see 8 different doctors on one block, I don't even know what that feels like. I can't go down a block right now in any neighborhood outside of a hospital, of course, and see 8 different doctors with different specialties on one block in a Black neighborhood. That can't be. You cannot commodify that. I don't know, and the training and the doctors that are made from that, like generationally, not just the hotels and the theaters and things, but that human intellectual property cannot be commodified.
The economist in me would say you can. You can't retrieve the life that was lost. You can't retrieve all of that, but you can put a number on that.
If I can say, one of the things that both Mother Fletcher and Leslie Benefield Randall, who's 106, when they talk about, look, when we went to sleep and we were living in Greenwood, we felt rich, not because we were rich, with wealth, but because our community was rich, because we saw these Black doctors, we saw these Black teachers, we saw these Black lawyers, and we felt the power of being in a community that was self-sustaining. And that is worth something. And you can put some type of value on that. And then you think about just the property damage alone. Just the property damage alone is probably $500 million. Just the property damage alone, not the business opportunity and the loss of opportunity and the loss of life. How much is the life of a person like Dr. A.C. Jackson, who's considered the best Black doctor in America at the time, who was so well respected in a racist, segregated Oklahoma that he was a president of the Oklahoma Medical Society, not the Black Medical Society, but the Oklahoma Medical Society? What is the value of losing him being shot 4 times in the chest, allowed to bleed out for 5 hours and not having any children? What is the value of losing the hospital that he started and now we don't have a hospital? What is the value of that? And that's what's so important about our lawsuit, because what we're asking the court, we didn't ask for a dollar amount. What we're asking the court is an opportunity to go through and do a full analysis, to hire the Derek Hamiltons of the world, hire the Dr. Joy DeGraws of the world, hire the actual experts to come in and be able to give a full-throated, comprehensive analysis of what will it actually take to fully abate this nuisance or fully give a Greenwood Marshall Plan. That's what we're asking for. So we don't want to come with a specific number yet. We need the data, like the data that's presented tonight, that is so powerful. We need the space and the opportunity, and for the court to force the defendants to give us the research and the information that we need so we can make those analyses and make those claims.
We also have to address the destruction of hope and the destruction of possibility. There are so many of us, all of us here have seen people rise up, but there are so many who say, well, you know what? We tried and look what happened. You know what? I tried to do things right and look what happened. I tried to advance myself and look what happened. That has value as well. And so, I think whether it's tangible or intangible, we can come up with a number. We can come up with a loss factor. Courts have been doing it all the time. So I don't want to see any bars to that in this instance. I see nothing that gets in the way. This is what courts do every day.
Right. But in Oklahoma, we've never once, and Black people started filing lawsuits about the massacre on June 5th. Days after the massacre, they were fighting from tents. B.C. Franklin was fighting from tents. And not one of these over 100 lawsuits have been filed over the last 100 years have been able to. But it's not because we can't. Right. But this is to the Oklahoma court system. This is who I'm talking to right now. We have not had an opportunity to move forward one time and have an actual day in court to talk about the merits of our case, do the proper analysis, get what the prescription is to do the Greenwood Plan. And that's why our lawsuit is so important. That's why Justice for Greenwood Foundation is so important. And that's why we need everybody to jump in. And as Dr. Hamilton said, it's an all hands on deck opportunity. While we still have living survivors and while we have the information, we need this victory in Tulsa.
I'm going to ask one final question. And it's a question I read somewhere. Asking the question, your brain has to find an answer. I don't know if we have an answer, but I want us to start this process. We're going to rebuild. We're going to. We may get reparations eventually, but we're going to keep fighting and rebuilding. What will it take for this to never happen again? I'm going to start with you, Derek Hamilton. What do we need to do to prevent what happened in Tulsa 100 years ago and all over this country, the Red Summer of 1919 and hundreds of other decimated communities in this country, Black communities? What is it going to take to stop it from happening again?
An anti-racist, anti-sexist economic rights agenda, recognizing that political rights aren't enough, that if we have economic rights for everybody that's implemented in a way that's antithetical to the Social Security plan you described, where you don't intentionally exclude domestic and agricultural workers because they're Black, but you intentionally design it so that Black people are included, that women are included. That economic rights platform gives people the less vulnerability to be seduced by fascism, that despotic appeal to have relative status over somebody else. In other words, we need that economic rights platform to neuter white supremacy.
Joy Chaney.
We need people in power who understand what Derek Hamilton just said and understand that everything must be run through an equity lens on one end. On the other end, we need accountability so that the cost of doing this again is too high to do it again, right? So that's also what we need. It's the combination of both altruism, goodness, but also a little bit of the stick.
Attorney DeMario Solomon Simmons.
Yeah, I echo both what Derek and Joy said. I agree 100% with what they stated. And we see with the January 6th insurrection, we see that if you don't have accountability, and and we already see that right now, it gives people the belief that they can move forward. And I think we have to believe and understand that something like this could happen again. And as a people, we have to prepare for that. I mean, we have to prepare to arm ourselves. We have to prepare to stand together. And we have to also make it clear to those of us in our community that go over the other side and get proximity to white power and sell us out. And when things get bad, they can't come back to our community. You have to realize, look, you got to stay over there because this is the time that there is no neutrality. There is no ambiguity. There is no both sides. It is the side of truth, justice, equity, and reparations and justice. And there's a side that's against that. And as we stated, anti-Black racism is real. We have to acknowledge that. And we even, President Biden today, he said about taking away economic rights and voting rights, that's simply un-American. That's not true. We have to speak the truth. The truth of the matter is that is American. Truth of the matter is racism is American. White supremacy is America. Taking voting rights is American. We have to be truthful with what's going on, speak truth to power, bind together with our resources and protect ourselves and understand at all times, as my grandma was saying, your grandma's told you also, we must be 10 times better. It's not fair. It's what it is. And we must not forget that.
Attorney DeMario Solomon Simmons, Justice for Greenwood. Y'all go definitely support what this brother is doing. Joy Chaney, National Urban League, thank you so much as well. Dr. Derek Hamilton, the New School, Institute on Race and Political Economy, thank you. And I'm going to hand this over because we're all going to be gone now. And let me say thank you, panelists. Thank you, everyone who joined us. This is just the beginning of a conversation that will end in action, I promise you. And joining us back is Dr. Bew, I apologize, and she will be joined by the one and only Wes Moore. They're going to have a conversation. I'm Karen Hunter. I'll see you around.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining today. So you've seen our data from the upcoming Tulsa report. You've been involved in looking at so much of this. How do you respond at a visceral level to the fact that it's 100 years after the Tulsa Race Massacre, the racial wealth gap is still where it is today?
For first thing, it's great to be with you, and that panel was fantastic. I mean, you know, when you talk about not just setting the stage, but setting the direction, that's exactly what we got. And the reality is it's impossible to look at the data and not feel not just a measure of devastation, but frankly, a measure of invigoration. It just shows how much farther we have to go. It shows about the fact that, that while we're talking about Tulsa right now, that the wealth disparities that we see between, Black and white people in this country as a whole is just as dire. And as we're talking about Tulsa right now, as was highlighted in the last panel, it's also important to talk about things like the unequal distribution of the GI Bill. It's important to talk about what was the history and the impacts of redlining in this country, the history and the issues with the Homestead Act within this country, the measures of creative and barbaric oppression that have been done against Black people in this country cannot be overstated. And so that's why when we think about, when Professor Hamilton talks about things like, all hands on deck, that's exactly right, because every single one of us are complicit. Every single one of these institutions are complicit, not just in the development and this exacerbation of the gap, but also, frankly, by not being able to use their levers, by not being able to be thoughtful about what it means in your own individual space, and then being able to use your own space to leverage others to be able to create different type of policy mechanisms, then you remain complicit in this atrocity that continues to exist against people of color and Black people inside of this country. And so, so when we think about this type of work, this type of holistic effort, the work that that we're leading on called 90 to 0, which really reflects the 90% wealth gap that we were alluding to earlier. This is about how can you provide a roadmap for businesses, organizations, nonprofit organizations, philanthropy, everybody who has their hand on the economic lever inside this country to advance racial and economic equity in their own way, and then being used to actually foster and move it towards needle-moving, expert-driven actions that can address these issues, and to know that we're addressing it in a real and a quality and a solid and a lasting way, unlike what we've seen before.
Thank you. So tell us about 90 to 0. What do we need to do in the next 10 years to get closer to closing the racial wealth gap?
Yeah, so I think some of the things we have to be able to do to close the racial wealth gap is first take an honest look about why this thing is created and what type of role that people have. People sometimes say, well, in order to close the racial wealth gap, then we need one segment of society to be able to do it. That's not true. Every segment of society has a role in order to do it. People say, well, we can, how can we put more towards philanthropic support? You're not going to philanthropy your way out of this. When you look at why these gaps exist and you look at the measures in which the gaps exist on this. And so when we're talking about some of the indicators we have to be able to make a dent on, during the next decade, we have to do things like closing the unemployment gap and understanding the fact that we have an unemployment gap amongst Black Americans that's twice as high compared to white Americans. That we have Black Americans that are missing from the highest levels of organizations and the boardrooms. 37% of the S&P 500 companies don't have a single Black director. There are 5 Black CEOs in the Fortune 500. Now, you cannot tell me the same way when we look at the racial wealth gap, how you have a 90% racial wealth gap. That's not because one family worked 10 times harder, right? That's systems. And if you look at the fact that we have 5 Black CEOs in the Fortune 500, that's not because one group is working that much harder. There are systems that allow for this dilution of talent to be understood and recognized and promoted and elevated. So how do we then address that and use that as a marker for what to do around it? The second thing we have to be able to do is we have to infuse Black capital and infuse capital in Black-owned businesses. Because right now, more than 60% of Black small business owners are turned down for loans. Rates are 2 times that of white business owners. And so when we think about that in perspective, it is impossible to grow if you do not have capital. It is impossible to grow if you do not have liquidity. And if we do not have streams and we do not have capital institutions that are close to community, that are lending to community, that understand community, then we'll never have the ability for our businesses to be able to grow with the same level of certainty and the great level of speed and pace that we do inside of other communities. Those are benchmarks that we've got to measure, that we can measure, and that we have to look at to know whether or not we're doing all of our own individual parts to be able to address these issues.
Thank you. So we've seen corporations pledge billions to Black communities in the wake of George Floyd's murder. We talked today, the panelists talked about some of the corporations that are still around today that are culpable to what happened in Tulsa and other areas. We know philanthropy has made investments. Do you think this is enough? And what do you see as the role of public policy in addressing the racial wealth gap?
So not only has it not been enough, it hasn't even been delivered. When you consider the fact that there are tens of billions of dollars that have been pledged in philanthropy and CSR that goes towards social justice issues and Black-led organizations during this period of time. But the reality is, of that pledge, only 250 million has actually made it to the ground. And so we're still seeing a level of performance that is then taking place when it comes to our ability to be able to use all of our individualized levers to be able to address these issues. And so it's powerful that we can get more corporations that are involved and talking about these issues. It's powerful that we have more CEOs who are willing to step up on issues that matter deeply to not just our now, but to our future. Things like whether it be voting disparities or whether it be housing disparities or whether it be income disparities. So we've seen movement. But the reality is that we have not seen practical application of the language that is then mimicked the language that is then taking place. But the second piece, as you correctly point out, is this is going to be about policy, that issues of economic inequality can't be solved by philanthropy or business alone, that every level of government must acknowledge and rectify the legacy of bias and the legacy of biased public policies that continue bolstering our socioeconomic divide. And that's through policy reforms, that's through policy development, that's not just through the federal government, but it's through local and state and federal decision makers that have a specific role to play. Because when we're looking at these disparities that do take place, we realize that it's not just Congress and it's not just the White House. These are state legislators, these are governors, these are mayors who have discretionary power of capital and also the power of the bully pulpit to be able to focus on these issues. But, we look at things like, for example, like the American Rescue Plan, where the adjustments we saw in the American Rescue Plan to the child tax credit, making it fully refundable, has almost cut child poverty in half. And it's one of the clearest understandings that we have that when people say things like, well, poverty is a choice, my answer is poverty is a choice. But it's not the choice of the individual who has the weight of poverty sitting on their shoulders. Poverty is society's choice. Poverty is a lawmaker's choice. Poverty and economic inequality and the racial wealth divide is not a choice of the individual who feels its pain. It's the choice of our society about how much pain in our neighbors are we willing to tolerate.
So as you look ahead, what concerns you and what sustains you to be able to do this work every day?
I'd say what concerns me is that if we look at this as just a moment. What concerns me is as we come up to the anniversary of these heartbreaking events, whether it be the anniversary of the murder that we saw on camera of Mr. George Floyd, or the 100-year commemoration of the destruction of Black Wall Street, that we build up this revved energy around the commemoration, and then weeks later we forget because we allow ourselves to get distracted, because we allow society to get distracted, and we allow those who do not want to talk about these issues to distract us. What concerns me is that we do not let this be a moment. We do not let this just be a movement, but we want this to be something that is true, lasting, monumental change within our society. And when I think about the things that sustain me, and the things that excite me about this moment is that data matters in this. And the truth is that it is impossible to run from the truth. The fact that we have people who now understand about the racial wealth gap and why it is so devious and so destructive. The fact that you cannot have real conversations about sustainable economic mobility if you're not willing to address the racial wealth gap, and the data reinforces that. The fact that we can have conversations about why something that happened 100 years ago is not, quote unquote, something that happened so long ago, but something whose impacts continue to shape generations of people now. And frankly, the fact that when we're talking about the racial wealth gap, when we're talking about the oppression behind it, that we're not just talking about this being, this being something that hurts one group, that growing Black talent, investing in Black businesses, that it's not a zero-sum game. In fact, frankly, if by not addressing it is a zero-sum game, that if we actually address these issues, that it's going to create an estimated, increase in US GDP by over $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years, that the cost to racial inequity that we've seen over this period is over $16 trillion. These are real numbers. So if you care about the growth of our economy, if you care about the growth of the US economic system, if you care about inclusive capitalism, then you cannot say that you care about those issues and in the same breath say that you are not willing to fight and advocate and push for and to do everything in your power to be able to address the racial wealth gap as well.
Thank you. Powerful words.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to turn it back over to Demario Solomon Simmons.
All right, good deal. Well, thanks so much. This has just been so full. Coming off this weekend or this last 3 days when we've had so many great programs, I was really very tired today. But I'm telling you, getting on this call with Dr. Hamilton and Karen and Joy and then Brother Westmore, who I'm a huge fan of, I'm just energized. And I like what Brother Westmore stated. This cannot just be a moment. It must be a movement. And the way we get a movement is that we collectively pull our resources together, we organize, and we fight together. And one way you can organize and fight with us here at Justice for Greenwood, you can go to justiceforgreenwood.org. Go to justiceforgreenwood.org right now. If you're listening, I want you to do two things for me. Go to justiceforgreenwood.org. I want you to sign the petition with our partner, Color of Change. And I also want you to donate. It can be $5, it can be $50, it can be $500, or whatever you can give to help us in this fight, because we must have a victory here in Tulsa. It is an all hands on deck scenario, as Dr. Hamilton talked about. We must have this victory. We can have this victory. We must have a Greenwood plan, not just for the Greenwood and Tulsa, but our entire community. Contact your elected leaders. Tell them we cannot just look at these numbers. We must actually have action. These numbers, these policy violence initiatives are killing us. These health disparities are killing us. Black people in Tulsa live 11 and 14 years less than white Tulsans. We are a food desert. We have no hospitals. And this is something we see in many communities. So connect with us. Connect with our descendants. Connect with our survivors. Stand strong with us. Sign up to be a part of our team. We have some amazing initiatives and programs that we're starting over the next couple of months. We have an amazing team, small but mighty. I appreciate them, and I appreciate all of you. So go to justiceforgreenwood.org. That is justiceforgreenwood.org. Connect with us, fight with us. And let me tell you one thing, and I'm going to be finished. We have one of our clients, Hal Singer. He passed away a couple of days before we filed our litigation in September. Hal Singer was 100 years old. He was on hospice care. He had had a stroke. He was blind. I actually felt bad calling his home, talking to his wife about our litigation and our case. I said, you know what? Should I stop calling you guys? I feel bad bothering you at this time. And his wife, Arlette Singer, said, are you crazy? Hal is going to fight until he has no more breath in his body. He's going to fight for justice for Greenwood. She said, because Hal believes, regardless of the battles we may lose, we must fight for our rights and our dignity. We have a right to reparations. We have a right to respect. We have a right to repair. We have a right to restitution. And we have a right to have dignity, to walk as free Black people in this country and be first-class citizens. Justice for Greenwood, justice for Greenwood, justice for Greenwood.
We had a lot tonight. We had data, we had discourse, we had calm, we had cool, and we clearly had fire. Demario brings the fire every time. I'm going to be brief because I'm hungry. I imagine the rest of y'all who generously stayed with us and tuned in. It's late in the evening, so I'm just going to end on some notes of thanks. Of course, I'm going to lead with Demario Solomon Simmons and the whole Justice for Greenwood Foundation, especially Kate Ritchie, who's a co-author on the report, along with Demario, and Chad Clayton, who's been managing the tech for tonight. I want to give a shout out to Afranima Bew. I'm going to say Dr. Bew. And you know what? I'm going to claim her because she's my doctoral student and she just finished this year. So at least for the next year or so, I'm still going to be claiming you as my doctoral student, but putting a doctor in front of it. She's the lead author on this report. She, with Kate, put in a whole lot to make this event happen. I want to thank the whole Institute team. You don't see them, but they're doing a whole lot behind the scenes. I want to thank Wes Moore, of course, for not only those brilliant remarks, but everything he's doing with 90 to 0. And a quick shout out to Sam Tweedy as I give a shout out to 90 to 0. Joy Cheney was a stand-in for Mark Muriel and certainly fulfilled that role and then some. She can stand on any stage and hold her own. And then finally, I want to thank Karen Hunter. She was a host extraordinaire. She's brilliant, she's dynamic, and she sets people up to succeed. And on that, I just want to say thank you again and have a great night.